Welcome back to the I Am Passionate podcast. It's your host, Jaren Smith, and I hope you all are having a somewhat warm weekend. I know it's been pretty cold in a lot of places across the United States, but I hope you all are in a warm place right now as you're listening to this podcast. So on today's episode, we're going to talk about, all the head coaches that, got new jobs, over the past week. We're going to talk about the divisional round, so last week's playoff games, and we're going to talk about today's playoff games. So to talk a little bit about, today's hire, the hires that happened in the last week, essentially, I'm going to tell you, what team hired who and how I feel about them, and I'll even try to give it a grade. So we're going to start with the Pittsburgh Steelers hiring Mike McCarthy, the former Dallas Cowboy and former Green Bay Packers head coach. I'm going to give this move like a C+. I don't really like this move. I feel like the Steelers were kind of like the Ravens you need to adapt a little bit more to modern NFL. And I feel like the Ravens had done at least a little bit of a better job adapting to modern day NFL than the Steelers have. But I feel like, Mike McCarthy, I don't think he's going to really, adapt to, anything. I think the Steelers aren't going to really change as much as, they should. I think they kind of have the potential to almost still continue to be, a 9-8 team, depending on, how their offseason goes. But I mean, Mike McCarthy, he is a, good head coach. He had some decent years in Dallas, had some okay years with the Packers, but I'm not really moved by this. I would have liked, Brian Flores in this job a lot more. Moving on to the New York Giants, they got the former Ravens head coach, John Harbaugh, which I don't think this is a bad move, but I think that, all the blown leads, I'm kind of surprised he got hired so quickly. I think that, John Harbaugh can bring, structure to the New York Giants and, potentially turn them around because, they have some of the pieces on offense. They got a great defensive line. They just kind of, put it all together. And I'm sure Todd Monken is going to, go to New York to be with John Harbaugh. So, we'll kind of see who the Ravens would hire for their offensive coordinator position. And speaking of the Ravens, they hired the former Chargers defensive coordinator, Jesse Minter. Jesse Minter also used to be on Baltimore's staff, from 2017 to 2020. Then Minter went to Michigan, and was with, Jim Harbaugh for a couple of years, and then, followed, Jim Harbaugh to the Chargers. I think this is a good move for Baltimore because I think that they need to essentially get that defensive side of the ball to just play consistent because the last 2 years, they essentially, they've started to, turn it on in like week 9 and like, that's not good because that's not like you need to, kind of start earlier when it comes to, you can't have a defense letting up about 400 yards a game, in the the first 5 games. Like that's not good. And, the last 2 years, that's what the Ravens had struggled with early. But then, the defense, kind of got them in a position to either A, make a playoff push or B, make a run in the playoffs. But Jesse Minter, I think he's going to have fun scheming things for, Kyle Hamilton, Roquan Smith. I'm curious to see how he's going to use Marlon Humphrey. And I think that, the Ravens defense they won't be like what they were in 2023, but I think they will be close to it. Next, we have the Tennessee Titans hiring Robert Saleh, the former Jets head coach and the 49ers defensive coordinator this past season, and he had another stint with them a couple years ago. And so I think this is, a good move. Considering that the 49ers, they had a lot of injuries on that defense and they had, a bunch of people that, a lot of fans would not know off the top of their head on defense. So I think that, he's going to slowly start to turn around that Tennessee defense. They're going to be competitive and, they're going to, start playing games. And then we're going to see who gets hired as the offensive coordinator to see if Cam Ward can kind of take that next jump. I don't anticipate them being, a playoff team next year simply just because, I think that there's still a lot of holes on the roster, but I do think they have a, good situation, kind of brewing in their building. If they can, add some free agents, have a good draft class, I think they're in a decent situation. Moving on to the Atlanta Falcons, Kevin Stefanski. I saw a lot of people, not liking this move, specifically a lot of influencers, who basically either A, are from the state of Atlanta, or B, currently live there. I don't think this is a bad move. I think that, Kevin Stefanski, he essentially did do well when the Browns had a decent roster, getting them to the playoffs, winning a playoff game. I believe he won 2 Coach of the Year awards. I think that's worth some praise, and I get it. The last 2 years for the Browns, they were not pretty. They were not pretty at all. But I think, the Falcons, they have that defensive structure in place, so I think they're already going to be fine on that side of the ball. And, with their quarterback situation, if they have to, rely on Kirk Cousins, for next season, I think Kevin Stefanski can get the best out of Kirk Cousins. And, if Michael Penix, comes back healthy, able to play, I think that, Kevin Stefanski can help Michael Penix take that next jump. And then lastly, we have the Miami Dolphins hiring Jeff Hafley, the former Packers defensive coordinator. I think this is a good move. I think that, they need like a different kind of culture in Miami, and the culture, with Mike McDaniel, who is the Chargers offensive coordinator. I don't think it was there. I think they need to start on the defensive side of the ball because they have, like Devon Achane, they have, Jalen Waddle. They have, some cornerstone pieces to, build their offense. They're likely going to move on from Tyreek Hill. They're likely going to move on from Tua, which, we're going to see probably an entirely new Miami Dolphins offense next season. But I think, getting that defense going, it's in the right direction. And lastly, there's not been a hiring in this position just yet, but it's still worth mentioning. The Bills, they still are looking for their head coach because they fired Sean McDermott, which I don't think that was the right move personally. I think Sean McDermott was a good head coach. I think that their GM was the questionable decision. And plus, there was a lot of comments about specifically wide receiver Keon Coleman that apparently like upper management, did not want the Bills to, the Bills did not want to draft Keon Coleman, which I think that means Keon Coleman is going to be out. I don't even think that's something that should have even been said. Like, that's just insane. Yet, because like I would imagine, mental health wise, it's like, dang, like that's going to just have like such a huge effect. But hopefully, Keon Coleman is able to, essentially get out of Buffalo, a place where he was not wanted, and, kind of get back on his feet, so to speak. And the Bills, they do need to surround Josh Allen with weapons. And you're probably saying, Jaren, why would you get rid of Keon Coleman? Because then he's going to have even less weapons, which, I mean, that is true. But I don't even think Keon Coleman was the answer. I think that, they needed a true number one wide receiver. So that is it in regards to, the, head coaching hires. We're going to talk just a little bit about the divisional round playoff matchups. Nothing crazy. For the Rams versus Bears, I think the Bears are going to be competitive for years to come. I think he needs to get, as in Caleb Williams, he needs to get that consistency with his throws, because I still think, the entire last season, basically he makes the easy look difficult and the difficult look easy. And, at my job the other day, some of my coworkers were having like a discussion, and one of my coworkers doesn't view Caleb Williams as a superstar quarterback just yet, which I agree. I do think he's on his way to becoming a superstar quarterback. I think he, makes superstar plays, but you can make superstar plays and not be a superstar caliber player yourself. But I think he's on his way. I think if he is able to be consistent with his accuracy, which I understand that, Bears receivers throughout the season, sometimes they drop throws, which, that's going to in turn, affect Caleb Williams' stats. But I think that, I think Caleb Williams, I think once he gets that consistency a little bit more, that'll only help him. And I think that, next season, I think in the offseason, the Bears in the free agency, they need to get a defensive line. They need to get a pass rush. I think if they do that, that'll only help their team even more. The secondary is not bad. They were banged up for a lot of the year. I think the Bears need to also add a linebacker. On the offensive side of the ball, I do think the Bears need to add another offensive lineman. Um, Otherwise, with their receivers, I mean, adding one I don't think would hurt, just as an extra caliber player. But I think, with Luther Burden, Cole Kmet, Colston Loveland, Romo Dunze, Zacchaeus, I think they've got, a good group of wide receivers, and like targets in that building. So I think it's, an offense that, can compete. And the Bears, they almost won that football game. I think if they would have, there was essentially 3 opportunities that the Bears could have had to kick field goals. I think at the start of the game, they should have kicked their field goal. And I think they had one other opportunity where they got stuffed. The Bears basically 3rd and short, 4th and short play calling was just a disaster in that game. But I understand that kicking, especially how cold it was in Chicago, it's not a guarantee. But I do think that very first possession of the game, the Bears would have made that field goal. And that field goal ended up being the difference in the entire game. But I think the Bears are going to be in a good place. And also Caleb Williams, that throw to Cole Kmet, that was insane. That was insane. And the last thing I have to really say is about the Rams. I'm surprised they did not try to run the ball more. The Bears, they didn't have the best run defense. But yes, the Bears defense did come to play because Matthew Stafford didn't really look all that insane. Neither did Puka Nacua, neither did Devontae Adams. Their pass offense did just enough for the Bears to win. But otherwise, it was just kind of just a crazy, defensive game all around. 49ers versus Seattle, this is going to be short because this was BTA. Seattle looked very dominant, doing whatever they wanted to in all 3 phases. And also really just the fact that the 49ers got as far as they did was just insane. And I do think they need to do something about their stadium because, they're way too close to that power plant, which I believe is a 5G facility. They've been the most injured team by far over the last decade, which I think is just insane. The Texans versus the Patriots. I think if CJ Stroud had played average against the Patriots, I think they would have had a better chance to win at the end. CJ Stroud had 4 bad interceptions. Pretty much almost all of them were bad. One of them I think was a little bit high, but the receiver still got hands on the ball and it ended up being intercepted. And that Texans defense, they're legit. They still had chances to win despite, the offense not, doing their job. The Patriots, they did not play amazing offensively, but on the other side, defense, they made the Texans offense look like a JV team. And so hey, it's a good thing when one side of the ball is not playing as well, but your defense is, bailing you out. That's a good thing. It's just not a thing that you want to rely on from each and every week. And then lastly, the Bills versus the Broncos. I still think that this was the year for Josh Allen to win the Super Bowl. I understand that this was not the best Buffalo team that he has been on. I understand that, and I agree with that. I just think he is not going to have another opportunity like this. Now, I'm sure, if this was me, I would want to have to go through the Patrick Mahomes, the Lamar Jacksons, the Joe Burrow. I understand that was the narrative, I kind of was painting before with those 3 not being in the playoffs. But I think it would make a potential Super Bowl victory for Josh Allen if he ever makes it to the big game all the more memorable if he's able to beat those 3 or at least, some form of those 3 and, get to the Super Bowl, beat whoever, he ends up playing on the NFC side of things. But I don't know if the road to the Super Bowl is going to be any easier because the Bills fired their head coach. They still need to get Josh Allen some weapons. I think that, Lamar Jackson, he's going to come back next year. The Bengals, even though that they still have their head coach, Zach Taylor, I think, if they can, get off to a stronger start next season, they'll be a factor in play. Even though that Patrick Mahomes is not guaranteed to play next season, it is possible that he recovers and makes a potential return. So it is a chance that Patrick Mahomes plays next season. I think that, it's going to be tough. I do think the Bills are going to make the playoffs next year. I think they are. But do I think that they are going to make the Super Bowl next year? I'm not confident in that right now, but hindsight is 2020. I'm speaking about this on January 25th. Who knows? 9 months from now, they could be undefeated. And so the Bills, also with Josh Allen, he did not look good in this game. That fumble before half was a very stupid decision. He could have thrown the ball away, and also he was only carrying it with one hand like he was Deion Sanders. And I think he just did not play a clean game. And I think if he was a black quarterback, I think the media would be, like slandering him, like talking negatively about him. I think it's just insane. And he had, I think it was Dawson Knox wide open, which he overthrew, which, like they needed, the Bills could have potentially won that game despite all of Josh Allen's turnovers. And I feel like Josh Allen is kind of, the talk about him as being a little overlooked because, CJ Stroud did not play very well. I think CJ Stroud is getting the worst end over Josh Allen when they both had several turnovers. And then talking about the Broncos, this Broncos offense still scares me, even if Bo Nix did not end up getting hurt. I think the fact that, they had to go to overtime, they only won by 3, I think was just insane. And I think they should have beaten the Bills by at least 14 points. I think they did. I think they should have. But hey, it is what it is. So now time to talk about today's games. We have the Rams versus Seattle. I think this game is going to be better than the eventual Super Bowl matchup. I think the games that these two teams have had this season have been insane. Yes, I do think Sam Darnold has struggled in these games a little bit. He struggled against the Rams basically since his last game as a Viking and then into this season. But in the second game, he was able to make plays in that second half to, get that win. And I think that the Rams, I think they're going to have to let Matthew Stafford be Matthew Stafford. I say that because I do not think Kyron Williams is going to be able to run the football very well. I don't think the Rams as a whole on offense are going to be able to run the football very well. I think Seattle is going to basically say like, hey, Matthew Stafford, you're going to have to throw the ball 40 times. We're going to hit you and you're going to have to, go through it if you're going to want to win this game. But I think ultimately the key to this game is going to be Sam Darnold. I think if he plays, even if he plays like he did last week where he didn't have to do as much, I think if, Sam Darnold, plays a clean game, he doesn't have to, force the ball, downfield. I think if he plays, let's just say if he throws like 200 yards, maybe gets a touchdown, I think if he does something like that and, he doesn't throw the ball more than 25 times, I think they have the chance to win the game. Because the Rams defense, the last few times that they played Sam Darnold, they've confused him a lot. But I think this is going to be kind of a low-scoring game at the start. Then we're going to see some scoring, in the second half. But I think Seattle is going to get back to the Super Bowl, and I think they're going to get the win 30-20. Moving on to the Patriots versus the Broncos in the AFC Championship game. I really would have been more excited if Bo Nix was healthy for this game. And Jarrett Stidham is going to be the starting quarterback for the Denver Broncos today. I do think Sean Payton is going to make the game, kind of easier on Jarrett Stidham. I don't think Jarrett Stidham is going to have to throw the ball a crazy amount. I think he's just going to, be essentially a game manager. I think that they're going to rely on the run. I don't think they're going to ask much of him, maybe make occasional plays. Like at least he's going to have to make a good third down play at least 3 times in this game. Whether that good play is, completing a first down, extending a play with his legs, or even throwing the ball away. I think in a big game like this is his first start all season. If you're in a third down situation where either A, you're in field goal range, you have a chance to kick a field goal, or B, maybe you don't want to give time, to like the Patriots, maybe nothing's open. Throwing the ball away would be very, very helpful because, throwing the ball away could help, keep points on the board, for the Broncos. It could also, them have to punt because having to punt the football, it can be a good thing because you don't want to go for it early on a fourth down, don't get it, instead of the Patriots with, good field position. I think the Patriots get a victory should just be their defense. I think that they should completely try to stop the run game and force Jarrett Stidham to beat them. And I think, Drake May, I do think he's got to take care of the football from a making sure that they don't fumble perspective. He's got to have better ball security because against the Texans, which I understand that they have a great defense. The Broncos do too. But I think if he takes care of the football, in the pocket, have, better pocket awareness in this game, I do think that, they should come out with this win. I think this is going to be even more of a defensive game than, Seattle and 49ers. I have the Patriots winning this game 20-17. I have them advancing to the Super Bowl, for the first time since 2018. And yeah, I think in the Super Bowl, it's going to be a Seattle versus Patriots rematch where I would not be surprised if we saw many members of the Legion of Boom just at the game in general, just to see that Super Bowl. And yeah, I think my original prediction, which was Rams and Texans, at least the Rams side was not very far off. And it's very possible that we see them go. The Texans, we all know what happened to them. But that's all I have for the I Am Passionate podcast on today's episode. I am Jaren Smith, and I'll see you all next time.